So of course, things like rat studies are never going to be as good as human studies if we want to learn about human metabolism. But interestingly enough, there are enzymes and transcription factors, and deep down in the metabolism, we have a conserved metabolism throughout a lot of these species, and so this is why rat studies can actually be quite useful. They might not be as perfect as a human study, but they can be useful, and I do think studies like this are worthwhile looking into, potentially hopefully lead to more research in the future for humans. But I want to talk about a specific fat in this video that I'm getting very interested in and would like to see more done on, and I'm going for a deep dive. So hopefully I find more information and I can do follow-up videos. But essentially I'm talking about coconut oil, and there are two very interesting types of fats that you find in coconut oil. Now, when you think about fats, you think about like a steak, for example, the fat that comes off the steak, it's going to be a mixture of different fats. It's going to have monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and hopefully a lot of saturated fats as well. It's the same with coconut oil. It's going to have a mixture. The type of fats that you find in coconut oil are heavily saturated fat. In fact, it's probably the most saturated fat that you can actually get. Interestingly enough, it's got a mixture of MCTs, which I'm sure you've heard about before. We all know that MCTs tend to come from coconut oil. It also has a mixture of some long-chain saturated fats like palmitic acid and stearic acid. This is 16 and 18 carbon saturated fats. They're useful, but I'll explain more about that in a moment. But the two fats that I really think are fascinating here and that are very different to these other saturated fats are these things called lauric and myristic acid. So lauric is 12 carbon completely saturated fat, and myristic acid is 10 carbon, I believe. Let me talk about this study first to just kind of put things into context. In this study, it was a rat study, but it's really fascinating. And so what they did is they had a couple of different groups of rats. Now, these rats are, they start off on this low-fat diet where it keeps them lean, and that's always worked for them. And then what they do is they have one group that stays on that lean diet, and then they have another group that they put on a high-fat diet that is made to make them get fat, get obese essentially. They put them on that diet, it works a charm, these rats get quite obese. And then what they do is they're like, okay, well, let's take the fat out, let's reduce the fat, we'll put them back on the same diet that they were originally on, the low-fat diet, and they'll lose weight. They didn't, they were stuck. It's almost like even though they were eating a low-fat diet, they just could not get back to their original levels of fat. They were stuck in obesity essentially. And then, of course, as you can imagine, just so we can say here as well, the rats that stayed on the low-fat diet, of course, were lean the whole time. So you've got this group of rats that are fat because they've been put on a high-fat diet that's supposed to make them get fat. They try to lose weight by dropping the fat level, and they're stuck in obesity. Then what they do is they, for some reason, I don't know why, think about, why don't we swap the fats to this specific type of fat called lauric acid, which, as I said, you find heavily in coconut. And so what they did then is that when they changed the fat over, these rats returned to their original body fat levels. Isn't that fascinating? So it wasn't until they added in the lauric acid that the rats were able to go back to their original weight via using, obviously, a diet that was a bit more restricted. And I just think this is interesting because there's a lot of people, of course, that are fat, that are obese, and they go on a restricted diet and they're not able to lose that weight. And one thing that fascinates me greatly is trying to figure out, why does this happen in some people and how can we get unstuck? How can we get people from being in that place where they've tried absolutely everything and they cannot shift that weight? They are stuck. And over the last probably 5 or 6 years, since I've been studying biochemistry, I found it fascinating learning about saturated fats and how they seem to have this fascinating ability to increase our metabolism and help our metabolism to essentially run faster, and in that way keep us leaner, and potentially also help people to get unstuck, or animals and people to get unstuck when they are obese and they cannot lose weight. And it's all to do with the fact that, well, it seems to be heavily to do with the fact that people that get obese tend to have very high levels of unsaturated fats stored in their body tissue. And of course, it doesn't help if they're continuing to consume a diet that is high in mono and polyunsaturated fats. And so what I've come to discover is that if your diet is high in very saturated fats and very specific ones, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but also you store a lot more of the saturated fats, your metabolism tends to be higher, and you tend to obviously be able to stay leaner. And so one other thing that's fascinating about this study that you'll see if you go and have a read of it is that, and that might also explain what's going on here, why the lauric acid helped them to return back to their original lean body weight, is that they looked at some other markers that we also have conserved in our body too. We have these transcription factors called SHRB-P, PPAR gamma, and fatty acid synthase essentially. And all you really need to know is they help us to gain fat. They get us fatter. And so if they are turned on, you're going to get fatter. If they are turned down, you're more likely to be not fat. You're able to break down that fat and use it for energy. But again, if they are switched on and they are high all the time, then you're going to gain weight. So what they found is when they looked at the expression of these in the rats, they found that adding the lauric acid helped to reduce all of those transcription factors. So they found lower SHRB-P, lower PPAR gamma, and lower fatty acid synthase. What they also found is that if you haven't heard of the sirtuins, all you really need to know for this video is that the sirtuins play a role in also keeping our metabolism going and high. And they found that the introduction of the lauric acid also increased the sirtuin activity. So you can see how these rats were able to finally shred that weight. What I think is also fascinating here is that if you look at cultures, and there are not many, because there's just not much of this data out there, and I'd love to see more on this, but there is a group of people, a Polynesian society, that they've done a couple of studies on, and they looked at what their diet intake was, and they looked at also their levels of saturation in their body fat tissue. And as you can imagine, these people are Polynesian. They live in, I suppose you could say, tropical areas, and they're eating a hell of a lot of coconuts. Like when they actually calculated how much these people were eating, I think it was like at least 1.25 coconuts every day, as well as a little bit of some other stuff, but heavily their diet was like majority coconut products. And so therefore, of course, their diet is going to be very high in that lauric acid and myristic acid. And what's interesting about these people is that they do have a very saturated body fat. And from records of what people have said that were part of the studies, these people were lean, healthy, active, fit, but their level of saturation in their body tissue was very saturated, which to me would indicate that potentially with these types of fats, you can actually, by consuming a lot of them, shift your body fat over to containing more of that type of fat, as opposed to others. So you're essentially shifting the ratio of your body fats. And of course, if you have more of these fats that you're trying to burn, you're going to have higher levels of the sirtuins, for example, higher metabolism, lower levels of those transcription factors, as I said, that are going to lead to body fat gain. I think this is really fascinating, and I encourage you to go and have a look at those studies and see what you think. And so for this reason, I've been adding a lot more coconut oil. As I said, coconut oil is probably the best source. You can also get these fats from palm kernel oil, not palm oil, palm kernel oil. But it tends to be more in like foods that are really heavily like packaged and stuff like that. So obviously coconut oil, you can buy beautiful quality organic coconut oil, or you can just eat coconut products. What else was I going to say on that? The interesting thing that seems to be able to happen with these types of fats that is different to other saturated fats, that I think is the point here, is that when you eat very saturated fats, what it seems to be is that, let's say we're talking about the main ones, so palmitic acid and stearic acid. They are heavily changed and regulated by these enzymes called desaturase enzymes. And essentially, the more obese you are and the more mucked up your metabolism is, the higher expression of these desaturase enzymes you're going to have. And so if you have really high desaturase enzyme activity, you're going to be converting your saturated fats into mono and polyunsaturated fats, which lead to a low metabolism. So the problem is, if you just eat more of these fats, like, what happens? Do they just get converted over to the mono and polyunsaturated fats, and then you just continue to get fat and the cycle keeps going? Potentially. I think so, maybe. When it comes to the myristic and the lauric acid, though, is that they are not as affected by these enzymes. They can affect them, but much less. And so theoretically, they're more likely to, if you consume these fats, actually change your own body fat level than if you were to eat other saturated fats. I hope that makes sense. Let's do a quick summary, because if you're still with me, anyway. This study is basically looking at why potentially, if you go on a high-fat diet and then you drop the fat again, why you can't always lose weight by doing that. Why can't you go back to your original body fat level just by reducing the fat? And potentially it could be that the fats that you've consumed in that time getting obese have shifted your body fat essentially to being less saturated. When you add in a very special saturated fat found in coconut oil called lauric acid, things change and you're able to lose that body fat, in rats anyway. It also helps to reduce fat creating transcription factors and enzymes, and helps to increase the ones that are going to help you to break down fat and not store it. So essentially, there's a couple of ways in which this particular type of fat found in coconut oil can actually help to increase your metabolism. And as I said, looking at some cultures that traditionally ate a lot of, like a heck of a lot of coconut products, the Tokelau, for example, what we can see in their body fat tissue when they were tested is that they ate a lot of these coconut products and therefore a lot of this lauric acid, and their body fat tissue was filled with it. So potentially there's something about this fascinating type of fat that can actually, when you consume it, it actually gets incorporated into fat tissue, which you do want because it helps to increase your metabolic rate, essentially. If you eat other fats that are saturated, if you're healthy and normal, potentially they could get incorporated. And I believe, from what I understand, you know, your body is breaking down, when it does break down fat, it is breaking down a mixture of what you've just eaten and what you have stored. And so of course, if you're just constantly eating saturated fat, then your body's going to be breaking down a lot of saturated fat, which is going to help your metabolism stay high. But the difference between this lauric acid and myristic acid is that it's not affected by the desaturase enzymes, and therefore what you consume does seem to get incorporated to your body fat. When you burn that body fat, your metabolism stays high. Hope that makes sense.